see you all here. So today's program is not a regular concert as you would think of for a classical concert. So after graduating from Colburn, I really began to think about how to keep classical music alive, how to keep it socially relevant. And I've spoken to a lot of different experts, starting from neuroscientists to now I'm working with social psychologists. And I've realized that in this day and age, we go after all these things that are quantifiable, data, academic findings. But that these things don't invoke emotions. We don't associate emotions to numbers. And emotions are what determines our actions. So when we hear of millions of refugees out of Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, all these countries, it just overwhelms us, but it doesn't register to our emotion. And what does register to our emotion and move us to be engaged in some kind of action are things like storytelling and communal experience of music. So now I know that when we listen to music together, our heartbeats start synchronizing. We start breathing together to the phrasing. Even our brainwaves start synchronizing. And as social animals, we find this really reassuring. And same thing with the storytelling. We identify ourselves with the heroes in the journey. And today, I have a very special guest who is going to talk about his grandfather, Ernst Toch, a composer, was very celebrated in Europe, but he had to escape the Nazis and ended up in Southern California, very close to us. And let's follow his journey. And music really enhances our capacity to empathize. I want to see what we can do together today in this hour. Welcome. So here is Mr. Lawrence Weschler, a very celebrated author that I knew even before I knew the name Ernst Toch, and I'm so grateful that he's here with us today to share his story of his grandfather.
Thank you, Makiko. This, by the way, is Makiko Hirata. And as you'll see for yourself, she's quite an amazing pianist, but also she's worth following on all kinds of grounds. We can talk about that more later on, too. So, okay. Let's see here. Back in the 30s, here in Los Angeles, there was a tremendous group of refugees fleeing Hitler that arrived here of all sorts. Bertolt Brecht and Feuchtwanger, but obviously in music, Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Toch and Eisler and all sorts of people. And among the emigres in those days, they had a famous story that they would tell each other about two dachshunds that met on the Palisade in Santa Monica. And one of the dachshunds said that when it's true, here I'm a dachshund, but in the old country I was a Saint Bernard. The thing is, my grandfather was a Saint Bernard, Ernst Toch. There was a time when he was a name to conjure with, but beyond that, his story is actually quite unusual and quite interesting. So I thought I'd tell some things, and then she'll show you some things, and we'll play out that game for a while. So let me begin by telling you, very unusually for a composer, and this, if you look up Nicholas Limsky, the great musical lexicographer, used to tell me how unusual my grandfather's life was, because he was born into, most composers, conductors are born into musical families. There was no music in his family. His father was a leather merchant. There he is over there, Gisela, Moritz and his wife Gisela, and Ernst is the little blue boy over there on the right-hand corner. I guess he's over here too. It's a case where they were the first generation out of the shtetl back in Moravia, arriving and making a living and so forth, and doing relatively well, but they certainly didn't expect to have a musician. They had no music, and not only was it not encouraged, it was actively discouraged. And in the case, and apparently Ernst must have been some sort of prodigy. The first time he was shown a piano, I think he was 3, and he played out the national anthem on the piano the first time he was able to poke out notes. When he was 4 or 5, they had a lodger who was a violinist, and he would look over his shoulder and he learned what notation was. And, but, you know, and he was talking like this, and his father was not impressed with this guy. No. You're going to either follow in my footsteps and be a leather merchant like me, or you'll do better, but you're not going to become a musician. And so the point that's interesting here is that he clearly was a prodigy of sound. There's all kinds of stories about that. But if you were going to be a prodigy of sound in Vienna, you were going to be a musician. Vienna, which, of course, we're going to, by the way, flip the beginning of the program. We're going to play Mozart first. Yeah. And, well, actually, why don't you play some Mozart, which is the kind of thing you certainly would be hearing all over the place. And
why don't you read the quote first?
You want me to do that first? Okay. We're going to do this all the way through because she wrote it down, but I got it all messed up, so I'm okay. So this won't be why I was going to have you do. Oh, that's fine. That's good. That's good. There's a tape somewhere of my grandfather saying what I'm about to read to you, but we can't find it. So instead, I'll do my grandfather imitation. So this is years later. He's telling the following story. I have not studied with anybody. I was left on my own and managed to acquire at length what I learned in a completely autodidactic way. I made the decisive discovery that pocket scores existed. The quartet I happened to see in the window of a music shop was one of the so-called 10 famous quartets of Mozart. I bought it. He's now talking about when he was like 7 or 8 years old. And I was carried away when reading the score. Perhaps in order to prolong my exaltation, I started to copy it, which gave me deep insight. I'll play some Mozart now, and I'll continue this. You want me to keep going? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. By and by, I bought and I copied all the 10 scores. But I did not stop at that. After having copied 3 or 4, I became aware of the structure of the single movements. And when I started to copy the 5th, I decided I would only continue with my copying up to the repeat sign, and then try my hand at managing that part myself, which leads back to the original key, which is, I later found out was called the development. When I compared what I had done with the original, I felt crushed. Was I a flea? Was I a mouse? Was I a little nothing? When I compared what I did with what Mozart did. But still I did not give up, and continued this strange method to grope along in this way and to force Mozart to correct me. And now he not only replaced for me every live-in teacher, but outdid them all. way talking to me about the tonality and the atonality of that piece.
Yes, yes. So, Mozart is an interesting composer, and that Toch should choose Mozart to draw inspiration from is also quite interesting. Mozart experimented a lot with chromaticism, as you just heard in this little minuet, right? And what I wanted to display with this choice is that, so in this piece, Mozart experiments with chromaticism, and sometimes it sounds really, really crunchy, and then he goes, oh, just kidding. And then he goes back to tonality. And in fact, Toch, who was, I think, 12 or 13 years younger than Schoenberg, right, who had the option of going atonal, he does exactly that. He experiments with chromaticism and atonality even, but somehow he chooses to always go back to tonality at the end.
So we'll see a bit of that. When he was 11, he had what he described as one of the happiest days of his life. He was walking down the street and he heard a paper boy calling out the headlines for that evening's newspaper. And the headline was, "Composer Brahms dies." And he says the reason he was happy, because he didn't even know you could be a composer. That this was a vocation, this was something you could be. and he started composing up a storm. By the age of 17, he had written 6 string quartets.
I'll play a very, very short piece by Brahms. And whether Toch consciously knew it as this was the sound world that he was born into or not, this was the sound of Vienna at the time. This is Brahms, Opus 118, number 1. Enjoy.
So I was sorry to say that he is doing all these string quartets. One of his classmates takes one to one of the foremost quartets, the Arnold Rosé Quartet, and they are performing it when he's 17. But, he's still basically, it has to be, his father has died and he has to be kind of the man of the house, and so he goes on to study medicine at the university. And in 1907, so he was born in 1887, he would have been 20 exactly, he applied, or he put in an application for a quadrennial prize called the Mozart Prize, which would be awarded 2 years later. And he more or less forgot it and returned to his medical education and wasn't expecting much. And then suddenly it was announced in 1909 that he had received the Mozart Prize. And the prize included a year at the Frankfurt Conservatory. This was going to be his first composition studies and so forth. And he says that when he arrived, the head of the department was a man named Ivan Knorr. And he said, okay, I'm ready to study. And Knorr said to him, I was going to ask you if I could study with you. And indeed, within a year, after that year, he is at the Mannheim Conservatory. What about come on. Okay. But the point is that the kind of music he was performing at that time was like this. I was going to
Okay, I'm glad you remembered. So this is a string quartet, number 8, written in 1909, the year that he won this coveted Mozart Prize. This is just an excerpt, just a little taste to whet your appetite.
Makako is being modest. She is the one who did the transcription from the string quartet. Anyway, so this is a picture of him, by the way, with his mother after he won the prize. I think that's kind of an adorable picture. And he basically stays in Germany, where the review, and he begins to develop a certain reputation. He's in Mannheim, he's an important teacher. It's 1910, 1911, 1912. The reviews describe some of his string quartets, such as that one, as, how many string quartets did Brahms have? I don't know. He had like 8 or 9 string quartets, and this is like the 10th Brahms string quartet. This is the 11th Brahms string quartet. It gets described like that. And occasionally he comes back to Vienna, where he is courting Lily Zwak, who is as opposed to his family, she is the highly cultured daughter of a banking family. That's her with her sister, Marianne. And 1912, 1913, 1914, they would play together and so forth. And so he's back in Germany mainly, but occasionally coming to Vienna. And then suddenly in August 1914, war is declared. And like almost all Austro-Hungarians, and especially all Austro-Hungarian Jews, he's an enormous patriot. And he immediately rushes back he has written a symphonic thing called An mein Vaterland, to my fatherland, and he rushes back and he enlists in the officer corps, and he is made a lieutenant in the infantry, and he is sent to the meat grinder of the Italian front. In fact, it turns out I was doing some research about this. I have a really good story about this, and later on today we'll be upstairs for those who want to come. We'll have a reception, and I will have time to tell you that story, so you'll remember to ask me about the place where he was located in 1915, which was, as my grandmother in her oral history, since she was the only one who knew, said very carefully, the little village of hot potato shit. I did a lot of research to figure out what that was, and it turns out it was about 5 miles away from where Hemingway was in the ambulance corps. And, my grandfather could have killed Hemingway. Or vice versa, I suppose. I don't know, anyway, but it didn't happen. In any case, very quickly, he married Lily, and Lily immediately set to work. This is one of the things I love about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to get him a cultural deferment. That, you know, you don't let, you know, composers and pianists and so forth be at the front lines. And the horror is that he was pulled back behind the lines into Galicia, which is where his family had originally come from, actually. And about 2 weeks after he was pulled back, his entire squadron was decimated in a battle. Anyway, the point of this is, he by the way, wrote a string trio in the trenches, a very, very beautiful string trio. But he arrives after the war, he returns to Germany, and he is a transformed person, and more than anything else, a transformed composer. And you had some stuff you wanted to read. I know that he had this text that began, "The musical revolution did not come about suddenly." And you like this passage, and I do too, but I think
Sure.
you read it.
Gradually, composers began to feel that the old idiom of tonality had exhausted itself and was incapable of utterance without repeating itself. That the once live and effective tensions of its harmonic scope were worn out and had lost its effect. Indeed, breaking free of that tonality was refreshing, even an inner need, as refreshing as a plunge into cold water on a tropical summer day. So I'm going to play another excerpt of a string quartet written in 1920 after he'd come back from World War I. Do you agree with me that it's quite different from the earlier string quartet? And in his intellectual storytelling, it may have been a compositional need, but I wonder if Toch would have felt this as refreshing as a plunge into cold water on a tropical summer day, had he not experienced the war in the trenches.
Yeah. And I think that basically is the origins of this phenomenal upsurge in the early Weimar and the Weimar Republic of what was called Neue Musik, new music. And Toch was very much in the middle of it all. 1919, 1920, 1921, his music is being performed all over Germany, so much so that by 1923, he is given a 10-year contract by the foremost music publisher in Germany, Schott, and you get a sense of the spiky, propulsive quality of its transformed quality with the burlesque, right? Mm-hmm. So
yes.
This is a piece that he wrote in celebration, right, of the Schott.
Yes, contract.
This is the first piece he gave.
Yes, so it's a suite of 3 pieces, and the last one is quite famous. You may have heard of this, The Juggler.
Is that hard to play? Is that hard to play?
My arms hurt.
Anyway, the next 10 years, from 1923 to 33, were years of extraordinary productivity for him. He was at all the music festivals. He was lots of piano music, several string quartets, lots of chamber orchestra pieces, operas, concertos for piano, for cello, for solo voice, being performed everywhere. I sometimes think about Weimar, Germany. For those of you who remember Pauline Kael in the New Yorker those days, when it really mattered in the 70s, what came out and everybody would talk about it, that was what it was like. It was this incredible sounding board. The next day, all the reviewers were out reviewing all the pieces and so forth. He was also a big character in theater productions with Reinhardt and people like that. He would do his own music, but he would also do experimental music. He was, for example, made pieces for player piano on roller, in which there would be 25 notes played simultaneously, and he created music for spoken chorus, no melody, but pitch, and first movement was all vowels. The second was all consonants. And then the third music movement, interestingly, was the geographical fugue, which you may have heard. And if you go online, you'll find dozens of performances. Trinidad and the big Mississippi, and the town Honolulu, and the lake Titicaca, the Popocatépetl, not in Canada, rather Mexico. Anyway, years later, I had occasion as a reporter to interview John Cage, and he said, "God, your grandfather was onto such great stuff." And then he went and blew it all on string quartets. But anyway, and he had that gleam. That's a very nice way of saying it. But in August Sander, the great photographer who took all the different types, bricklayers and cooks and so forth, photographs of the entire world of people in the Weimar Republic, for the composer had Ernst Toch. The New York Times in 1931-32, their big article of what's going on right now in Germany, it's Toch and Hindemith. There you see Toch and Kurt Weill in conversation at one of those festivals. They also have a daughter who is my mother. Anyway, so he's really soaring, and he is certainly a name to conjure with. Go back for a second. And then in 1933, I'll just give you some idea. Walter Gieseking, the great pianist, performed his first piano concerto 50 times and was scheduled to perform it a 51st time in London in April 1933, but Hitler comes to power in March, and Gieseking cancels that performance and never performs it again. Schott, 1923, says, something wrong, we're not going to renew the contract. The whole world starts collapsing. The conductor who was rehearsing his second piano concerto has the baton taken out of his hands by a group of brown shirts, and he's not allowed to finish that. Toch, who wasn't particularly political, sensed things right away and took advantage of the fact that he had been selected to represent Germany at an International Composers Conference in Florence, Italy, in early April 1933. He and Richard Strauss were the two representatives of Germany. And he just didn't go back. He instead went to Paris. He cabled Lily, the all clear signal, which in its entirety was, "I have my pencil," as if that would be enough. And from Paris, he goes on to London. He begins composing for films in London. He is the composer on the film that Christopher Isherwood wrote the screenplay for, that Alexander Korda produced, but that Isherwood later wrote a novella called Prater Violet. And so he was the pianist on that. He comes to New York. In fact, the signature there is it's a sign to the guy who directed Porgy and Bess. And he starts giving talks in America. And by the way, he is the founder of the music composition department at the New School when it was the University in Exile. He befriends George Gershwin, and interesting stories about that. But in any case, the point here is that he gives lectures to, and he's trying to say to people, Americans, news conferences, please tell your readers that they shouldn't try to take modern music and crunch it into the categories of older music. Let it build its own space inside your ear, and so forth. And then he's asked, what's your favorite food? And he says steak tartare, and the headline the next day is eats raw meat. I mean, that's... When I tell this story, when there's performances in Berlin and I'm invited to give talks and everybody chortles about how barbarian the New York Americans are, I say, yeah, no, it's true. It was, it was pretty Hicksville and it was, pretty hard, but at least there they weren't trying to kill him. But anyway, George Gershwin says, you should get out of here, go to Hollywood, because you could really get a thing. So he comes to LA, 1935, and he's part of that huge group I was telling you about. There's a photograph of him with Otto Klemperer, Schoenberg, him. He's got some strange animal in his hands there, I'm not sure. Prince Hubertus von Lohenstein. I don't know who he was, but he was a big deal, apparently. And he starts teaching at USC, but also private students over the next period. Andre Previn is one of his students, for example. And he starts composing for Hollywood. And these are the Hollywood pictures. They had Hollywood. I love it with a cigarette, and it's very handsome. And in Hollywood, he is seen with that Neue music. It's perfect for horror movies and for chase scenes. So back in the day, at 1 o'clock in the morning, you'd watch 1930s and 40s films late at night. This is before there were thousands of channels. And every time there was a chase scene, I said, I recognize that music. The sleigh chase in Heidi is his music. The Hallelujah chorus in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Charles Lawton, it's his music. I mean, all this kind of stuff. He had 3 Academy Award nominations, he was doing well, but he was not doing his own music. He had something like 35 opuses from 1918 to 1933. From 1933 to 48, he had 8, and really only 1 after the start of the war itself. He is desperately trying to rescue his family back home. He has 64 cousins. You have to do a separate affidavit with a separate amount of money for each one, so he's working like crazy. And his own music just dries up. And at the end of the war, he's just, it's a huge crisis. I mean, he hasn't composed anything of his own. He writes a book called The Shaping Forces in Music, hoping that he won't have to teach anymore. He just writes it. And really, the main point of the book is that there isn't a break between Mozart and Brahms and Schoenberg, that there's one continuous tradition, and that this will be seen eventually. And his daughter, my mother, weds in 1948, and he writes a string quartet march for her wedding march, and it's incredibly crushed and sad. And she asks, why is it so sad? And he just says, well, I'm losing you, But I think it's more than that. And in fact, around that time, 1948, he does begin composing again. He does a string quartet with the lines from Muerque, the poet, only through my tears can I see the beloved light of the sun. He does all kinds of rainbow references, and he composes a piece called Profiles. And maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah. So when Ren and I conceived of this program, Ukraine hadn't happened yet. But in the month leading up to tonight, I've been working on this piece, the collection of 6 pieces that Toch wrote right after the war, deeply depressed. He had the foresight to escape Europe early on. So he was healthy, he had his family, he had a nice home in LA. And we don't think of the plight of the refugees, after they leave their country. But, with the news going on and learning this piece, I felt like I now understand what survivor's guilt feels like.
I should mention, by the way, I forgot to say this, that of his 64 cousins, 32 perished in the Holocaust. Lily's sister perished in the Holocaust, and many, many friends and so forth. And so that's going on. It's somehow all the worse. If the war is over, you should be happy, but in fact, now you're finding out all this stuff.
Right, and it occurs to me now that, 1946, when this piece was written, this is when everybody in the world is seeing the images from the concentration camps that were taken by the American soldiers that were liberating these camps. So, yeah, anyways, so here are the 6 pieces from the profiles.
One of the first pieces he composes after the war, and after not having them composed for years. Akiko, we were talking about this a little bit this morning, but I didn't find you, you found me. And this was the piece that you were working on when you found me. And we were talking about why that might have meant something to you in your own family background. And you said some really interesting things. So maybe you can... or not. No.
Well, first of all, I know that some of the things in this piece is not comfortable, but I think, music isn't just a pleasantry, right? I think music gives us the space and time to share what we're supposed to not admit in our daily lives, like frustration, like anger, like pain. And I'm really glad that I'm getting to share this with you today, especially in the face of the challenges that we are facing in the world. So my maternal grandfather is an atomic bomb survivor, and my paternal grandfather went to a tropical island during World War II. And during the war, they could not have imagined me being a pianist, sitting here talking to you today and playing music for you and sharing my thoughts. And while talks, life, and music gives us a glimpse of, the sufferings that people still go through today, I also want to see this as an example of hope that we can still have. That that I am in America, that Japan used to fight as an enemy, right? And pleading to you for compassion and humanitarian aid for people who need it. I think that's the power of music, that's the power of human nature, despite the distractions that we seem to be capable of causing as well. So, yes. And also, I might add, so there are lots of Jewish immigrants all over the world when the Nazi came to power. And this is a very little known fact, but Japanese government, despite its alliance with Germany, accepted Jewish refugees throughout the course of World War II. This was because Japan had proposed a racial equality proposal for the Paris Conference, for the treaties of Versailles, because it was the first nation of people of color that were allowed to sit at the table for discussion for the League of Nations, and it was rejected. And so Japan, there are many reasons why Japanese government decided to accept Jewish immigrants into Japan, but one of the reasons was that it had to make a stance. And so lots of the Jewish immigrants that came to Japan were musicians. And my teacher's teacher was Jewish. So if that had not happened, again, I would not be here.
So let me just very quickly tell you what happened next. And we're almost at the end here, but so 1948, he has a devastating heart attack. It's almost like the fact that he was now able to start composing again, and all the pressures of Hollywood and the pressures of just everything was just too much, and he almost dies. And he doesn't die and does something really weird as far as I'm concerned, which is that he decides he's going, well, first of all, what's very interesting is he starts composing symphonies, which he's never done before. It's very unusual for symphonies to start in a composer after they're 50, and he just starts. And he starts out by going to Vienna, returning to Vienna in 1948. This is third man, really seems strange to me. And he writes his first symphony, which is dedicated to Joseph Fuchs, the boy who had taken the string quartet to the Rosé quartet, and has, this is also so classically German Jewish. He gives it a motto, from Luther. Although the world with devils filled shall threaten to undo us, I will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. His second symphony follows hard on, and it has the line from the Old Testament, I will not let thee go except thou bless me, and is dedicated, or as he says, dictated by Albert Schweitzer. Rather classically German Jewish thing to do at this point. And his third symphony, these are all kind of a trio of autobiographical symphonies, has a remarkable line from Goethe.
Werther.
And the line is, and it's coming to me just a second, of course I am a wanderer, a pilgrim on this earth, but can you say that you are anything more? And that one wins the Pulitzer Prize. The next period, the period from 1948 to his death in 1964, another 16-year period, is the most prolific of his life. He composes 7 symphonies in 15 years, an opera, all kinds of new string quartets. He's at the MacDowell Colony. By the way, that picture hung over my crib when I was a boy, and that seemed to me to be the oldest thing I had ever seen in my life. Anyway, but his third symphony here is being conducted by William Steinberg in Pittsburgh, and there he is, helping Leonard's continue living on. And that's one of the last pictures of him in 1964. And you have a piece, I think, one of his last piano pieces, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a short piece, but it's
yes. So after all this is the last piano piece that he writes 2 years before his death.
Toward the end of his life, he was giving talks, and there's a passage that you like especially.
Yes.
I thought I was going to let you read it. That was very resonant for you.
I'll read the first half, and I'll pass it on to Ren. So it's an essay titled, What is Good Music? Nearness to life, nearness to nature and humanity. Who has it? I think the one who contains in himself an irrational, unconquerable bastion, untouched, for which I have no other word but religiousness. To be sure, this quality does not refer to any specific creed. It has nothing to do with a man's interests and activities, nothing to do even with the conduct of one's life. The word religion derives from the Latin religare, to tie fast, to tie back. Tie what to what?
Tie man to the oneness of the universe, to the creation of which he feels himself a part, to the will that willed his existence, to the law he can only divine. It is a fundamental human experience, dim in some, shining in others, rare in some, frequent in others, conscious in some, unconscious in others. But there's no great creation, neither art or science, which is not ultimately rooted in this climate of the soul. whatever the means of translation and substantiation. In his last year, he said that he used to say that he was the world's most forgotten composer. He died in October 1964. By his bedside were drafts of a new string quartet. His wife, Lily, so I was 12, and I, of course, knew him, but my first 12 years were his 12 last, and he was busy composing. He was, so to me, he was a freak. He didn't know who Sandy Koufax was. But Lily lived 8 years beyond that, and during her last years, she kind of poured all of her knowledge into me. Faute de mieux, I was going to be the last one who was going to be able to take on the mantle, and that's another of his tragedies, because I am completely a musical. I am, and by the way, it's worse than you would think, because not only is my mother's father this big deal composer, my father's mother was the head of the Vienna Conservatory of Music's piano department. And I'm born in 1952. I am so amusical that there's an entire page in Oliver Sacks's Musicophilia at his astonishment at my patheticness. He waxes very eloquent on the subject. Anyway, there I am. It's kind of, I just show you, it's weird. He's holding me exactly the way he held that creature in that picture. And that is me. I mean, I consider this one of his tragedies, that the executive of his estate, what do I know about music, but I try my best. But this is you can see we're related. That bust, by the way, is by Anna Mahler, the daughter of Gustav and Alma Mahler. There was some truth to his being the world's most forgotten composer, in that he really felt, because he was so independent, and he wasn't a follower or a leader of any school, and he insisted on the continuity of the tradition, notwithstanding the importance of the vibrancy and so forth. He was seen as too traditional by avant-garde and too spiky and avant-garde by traditionalists, and this incredible amount of stuff that was composed just was not being performed. But with the passage of time, especially in Germany, but also somewhat in the United States, there's been a bit of a resurgence, not helped by me telling German audiences that they were trying to kill him, but virtually everything's been recorded. All the symphonies, all the string quartets, much of the piano music. The Shaping Forces in Music has been reissued. He shows up. There's entire museum exhibitions devoted to him, such as one at the Jewish Museum in Vienna, which was called Life as a Geographical Fugue. And I took my daughter, his great-granddaughter, along. She's a linguist. And she said, that's interesting. Geographical fugue, she speaks Latin. She said, fugue is from flight, from refugee, and so forth. Anyway, just continuing, there are concerts all over. There's a table outside as you leave in a little bit, which shows some of the kinds of things that are available. I did write a piece in your program, and you can find out a biographical piece about him. There's all kinds of things going on, and it seems to me that one of the things that's really exciting for me is that, I mean, these are some of my things about him. One of the things that are exciting for me is that young performers are finding their way to him. And so it's a great satisfaction for me to be able to be on stage with somebody like what seems to be one of the great pianists that this place has produced. It's Hirata. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, let's go upstairs. Thank you.